Do I recycle? Yes. Should people recycle? Yes. The reality is 80% of Americans, after decades long of education around recycling, still do not recycle. And then the vast majority, quite unfortunately, of things that end up in the recycling bin don't make it through the whole reclamation process. So I would continue to advocate to recycle, but ultimately the solution is uncycling. And uncycling is preventing the product from having to be made in the first place, in this case, single-use plastic water bottles, by creating a better solution at the source of the tap, which is what our mission is.
Hello and welcome everyone. I'm so glad to have you back for another episode of the Care to Lead interview series. Today, we're going to be talking about innovation and disruption, which are obviously a couple of my favorite topics. We're featuring Razgaitis, CEO of FloWater. Raz co-founded the company in 2013 with a vision for sustainable water innovation. Under his leadership, FloWater developed refill stations that convert tap water into ultra-purified drinking water. In 2022, FloWater became a Bluewater company and has achieved 80% growth with profitability, with over 10,000 stations saving nearly 1 billion bottles of water. Raz's commitment to sustainability positions FloWater as a disruptive force. Welcome, Raz. You've done so much. I'm so excited to talk to you.
Thank you, Cynthia. It's nice to see you in person here, and thanks for the opportunity to be on.
I'm really interested, as I started to tell you before we got on this call, I've been in some of the hotels that have used your product, and I was very impressed with it. But I think that often people don't really realize how much a product like this impacts their life and their ability and not just sustainability, but health-wise. Do you want to speak a little bit more about your product and what you do?
Sure. Yeah. Starting first with the health piece of it and then working backwards. That was one of the things that got me and has kept me invigorated in our mission, because 70 to 80% of Americans, and actually people even worldwide, are chronically dehydrated. And water, 70% of our body is made up of water, but then it also affects so many things. You could look at ADHD data and not only the medications that are used to treat ADHD, which cause dehydration, but also things like hydration affect hyperactivity to the quality and the aesthetics of your skin or satiety. So from that perspective, I get really excited about what we're building, because when we drop a FloWater into a hotel, school, gym, corporation, retail, we'll see anywhere from 100 to 500% increase in daily hydration.
Wow.
Now, that may sound like a lot, and it is a lot, but what it also really signifies is the average American is drinking very little water and a lot of other stuff, or not enough beverages and fluids at all. And so that's, of course, one of the objectives of our company is to really redefine the way the world drinks water and kind of radically change water distribution in the United States. And there's two fundamental problems to that. One is that there are 20 million pieces of water hardware in the United States that are used to deliver water in the form of water fountains, 5-gallon jugs, water coolers, and they're all really archaic. And they basically are just, for the most part, the majority of them are just dispensing tap water. And the problem with that is that 80%, 76% of Americans don't either trust their tap water, or they don't like the taste of it, or it smells funny to them, or it's off-putting. And so that has led to a huge proliferation of single-use plastics, not just single-use bottles of water, but also other single-use plastics that are sugary, carbonated, caffeinated drinks. And not only are those really bad for your health, including bottled water, because it absorbs so much of the plastics, and there are micro and nanoplastics that are in it, but it's also really bad for the environment. And so our mission is to really build a whole new water infrastructure in the United States. And we are in a world today where we have to treat our water twice. You can no longer rely on and trust municipal water. It's not the fault of the municipal water plants. We've contaminated the water, the source kind of upstream to that, where we've poured Roundup into our agricultural fields for many decades now. And we're literally now drinking our Roundup, and we're eating and drinking our plastics. And so our job is to put a really major dent in that by improving water quality, taste, trust back to the tap. And then ultimately, and I'll end on this, uncycling. So many big beverage companies talk about recycling, and that's actually, I think, in many ways propaganda that they're perpetuating. And so, do I recycle? Yes. Should people recycle? Yes. The reality is 80% of Americans, after decades long of education around recycling, still do not recycle. And then the vast majority, quite unfortunately, of things that end up in the recycling bin don't make it through the whole reclamation process. So I would continue to advocate to recycle, but ultimately the solution is uncycling. And uncycling is preventing the product from having to be made in the first place, in this case, single-use plastic water bottles, by creating a better solution at the source of the tap, which is what our mission is.
That's awesome. And you touched on a few things that I kind of want to circle back to. First of all, you talked about the corporate and the 5-gallon jugs. And as a former HR executive, coming up, there were more than one occasion where someone ended up with a workers' comp claim for refilling those big 5-gallon jugs. But I think my question about those compared to like what you do is I never understood, like it seemed like they were water coolers, but I never understood how corroded or what could possibly be happening between where that water jug sits and where it's coming into my glass or my cup. How does your water filter in that machine, and how does that be kept clean? Because that's always something that goes through my head.
That's a really great question. In fact, you just highlighted something that a lot of people don't know, but if you ever are replacing one of those 5-gallon jugs, you'll often see like some green sludge on the inside of that. And you have ambient temperature water that is, that whole dispense area and the area through which that water travels does not get regularly sanitized and, properly cleaned. And when people are replacing those 5-gallon jugs, they're not cleaning that out and disinfecting it. It's just like leaving a glass of water out on the countertop. And if you look at, data around kind of bacterial growth and viral growth over a period of days and weeks of water that's just sitting ambient temperature, stuff grows. Like that's just how it works. It's the same with leaving food out of the fridge and leaving water on the counter for a long period of time. And so one of the things that we've worked on solving is building a system that has not only a purification set of filters and membranes in it that is properly extracting the bad stuff from tap water and then introducing back into it the things that are needed for taste and absorption, like sodium, calcium, magnesium, and potassium. But also there's a sanitization system in there in the form of O3, which is activated oxygen or ozone. And that ozone fires off in the machine at setup for about 6 minutes. And then every 6 hours, about 2 minutes, ozone is being dissipated throughout the system and it permeates the lines. And that's one of the best ways to provide something that is of really high sanitary quality. Very few companies use it. We use it in all of the FloWater refill station products. The reason that we use it is because it is the best. It is spectacular in terms of sanitization and cleaning and permeating the lines. The reason people don't use it is because it's really expensive. But we basically had this perspective of, for $5 a day, we're going to provide and we're going to aim to provide the world's best tasting, most trusted water that people fall in love with. And hopefully they're willing to pay another $1 or $2 a day for it. And most companies are when they understand what the alternatives are and what some of the downsides are. But, not always, of course. I mean, there's some people where we have to finagle that discussion. But I think when people see the inside of a 5-gallon jug that's been uncleaned for a year or two, it's a pretty easy argument to make just on that alone, as well as the fact that you got a bunch of 5-gallon jugs that are sitting around and people are having to labor and store them somewhere and put them on. The irony about 5-gallon jugs is that it's almost as close to how civilization started getting water in the first place. So civilization was built around access to water. You'd go take a jug to the well, you'd fill it up, you'd bring it back to the village. And we're basically doing the same thing today. The only difference is we're also transporting these jugs all over the place, spewing fossil fuels and CO2 emissions. storing it in plastic, it's baking in plastic. The plastic is permeating that water. So that's like one example in society and civilization where I think we've actually taken what we were doing thousands of years ago and gone backwards with 5-gallon jugs. So that's what we're trying to help solve for.
That's actually very funny. And I will tell you, when I was staying in the hotels that did have FloWater, I did drink more water because you could tell when you go up to the machine to refill your refillable water bottle that they give you at check-in. Everybody gets this really cool water bottles. You want to keep them as a souvenir. But when you get that bottle, if I was going to a water fountain to refill that, there would be just all these things going through my head, like, what's in there? Like, is this clean? Is this, I didn't feel that at all. And I'm really a neat freak, like a clean freak. Maybe I'm a germaphobe. I never knew that until I started having this conversation, but I'm really picky. And there I wasn't. Like it was in multiple 2 or 3 hotels that we stayed in that they had it. And I did drink more water at those hotels.
Yeah. Well, it's great to hear. I mean, you sound like a very traditional consumer in that regard, which is, people do things, drink things, eat things, go on trips, buy things that they really like. And so, this is one of the, I think, interesting pieces of running a company and leading a company with a sustainable mission, which is, while that is one of our reasons for being, is to put an end to single-use plastic water bottles, and consumers advocate and rally around that mission, the reality is that consumers behave the way that consumers generally behave. Let's use straws as an example. If plastic straws are bad, and everybody feels badly for the aquatic life and the sea turtles, and you see the images, and it's, for some people very heartbreaking, but I think for all of us empathetic of, hey, we shouldn't be doing this. But if the alternative is a paper straw that melts in your mouth as you're trying to drink a beverage, it's really hard for consumers to change their behavior if they're not going to something that's as good as or better than their alternative. Our competitive set, 5-gallon jugs, water fountains, water coolers, 20 million of those in the US. But ultimately, what we're really trying to do is create a better bottle of water straight from the tap without the need to actually wrap something into plastic.
We've talked a little bit about your product, and the reality is you have disrupted an industry with the way you're doing things. And at this particular juncture in the world, disruption is inevitable. I mean, AI is coming into the picture. Everything's being disrupted. But as a leader who's taken an industry and caused a great disruption, tell me what you've learned from that experience and leading your teams through that.
Well, I think I would start by expressing appreciation for calling us a disruptor, but also I really want to acknowledge we've got a long ways to go, right? So when we started this 11 years ago, we started saving our first single-use plastic water bottle from the oceans, lakes, rivers, and landfills to where we are today with roughly 850 million bottles that have been saved from the environment. Really, really good progress. At the same time, this last year, in 2023, there were about 35 billion single-use bottles that were produced. Now, that not only includes water bottles, but also, sugary, carbonated, caffeinated drinks. And so we've got a ways to go. I feel like we're making our way into disrupting a category. It's a long journey, but it's one that's accelerating. And I think it follows very much the same suit as big tobacco in the 70s and 80s. And often when I'm talking to my team or I'm on podcasts or I'm speaking at events, I often compare big packaged water, big bottled water, big beverage companies to the big tobacco of the 2020s. And if you look at actually how they lobby, who they target, the youth that they target, the socioeconomic classes that they target, the addictive properties and propensities of the products that they sell, I guess it's not as bad as cigarettes, but we're talking about like being in the spectrum of bad and less bad. And I think if we can get rid of bad products by changing consumer preference, that's the ideal outcome that we aim to execute upon. And so, in terms of your question of disrupting a category and how to go about that, I think there's a few things that stand out to me, lessons learned along the way. Some things I and we have done well and we've done right. I also have a long list, and we could do many podcast series on things that I've done wrong. in decisions that I'd like to change or mistakes that I've made. And so we'll probably capture both of those. But in terms of the key success factors for that, one is always the team. I mean, at the end of the day, you can have capital, you can have a product, you can have good unit economics, a good gross margin. But if you don't have a really dialed in and wired team, nothing happens. And so, when I talk to my team, I talk about this in the context of, well, nothing happens in this business until a product actually gets sold, deployed, and implemented in a way that delights customers. And, we do that more often than not, but, we still have to always be focused on dialing that experience in. Conversely, from a company perspective, nothing happens until someone does something from a team perspective and having the right team involved. And so that's a big one. Another one is having a great product. People tend to say this a lot, that having a great product is paramount. I think there are a lot of times where it gets discounted of what does a great product truly mean. And so, I have these conversations internally and with colleagues and teammates quite frequently, which is to some degree, no consumer is going to say, hey, I want a refill station in the market, right? I wanted a FloWater refill station. So some of that just gets figured out by looking at what are the problem areas and how do you solve for that. But, part of that also is a lot of consumer testing and taking a concept, putting it in front of customers and consumers and dialing that in and refining and refining and refining. And that's why speed really matters in an early stage company. There's 3 principal reasons that companies do not succeed from its early stages on its way to building a business, which in some cases includes disruption. And one of those reasons is product market fit. And so the product market fit, if you don't have product market fit, you don't have customers that love your products, you don't have a business. And so I think as it relates to doing something this disruptive, having a product that causes a lot of leaning forward and enthusiasm and adoption by consumers, of course, in addition to team, that's going to be a hypercritical element. And of course, there's many others that we could talk about as well.
So tell me more about your leadership team. And are they based? Do they work remotely? Do they work all in the office? How does your leadership team? How many people are on your executive leadership team? And how many employees do you have?
So in the US, so within the FloWater entity, and we're now part of Bluewater globally, but the FloWater team has about 65 people in the company today. Those are spread throughout the United States, primarily 3 or 4 specific regions. And most of the people that are outside of Denver are either on the sales and the business development and the account management side of things, or the deployment, operations, technician side of things. And so everyone else is in headquarters here. I've got about 6 direct reports as of now. I'm about to hire a 7th. That comprises the leadership team. And so I have a woman that runs national accounts and wholesale channel for me. I've got another woman that runs local sales. There's a gentleman that is a chief operating officer, have a head of finance here, and then a director of marketing. And so that's the Denver headquarters for the most part. The sales-oriented people are generally out in the market, in the field, spending a lot of time with their team and their customers.
What's the biggest challenge you faced with leading your team?
I think alignment and focus is always a big one. That, of course, assumes that you have the right team. So at various stages, my answer would be different. And, so 5, 7, 9 years ago, at various points of the year, I would have said, well, getting the right team together or identifying the right skill sets that are needed for the next stage of the business growth. And so, my answer today is different than it would have been 2 years ago during COVID and 2 years before that as we were scaling from like 3 million to 10 million and then beyond. And so, focus and alignment is a tough one. And, people tend to feel like, oh gosh, when you go from like 20 to 60 employees, it must be easier because you already got 20 employees and 20 to 60 is going to be a lot easier than going from like 8 to 20. Well, the reality is 20 to 60, the problem with that is people are not learning by osmosis at that point because they're not interacting as much. When we had 8, 10 people in the office and we went to 20, it's quite a bit easier. One is 8 or 10 to 20 is only doubling, whereas 20 to 60 is tripling. And so things get kind of infinitely more complicated as you compound them. But the other thing is that, at a certain point, you can't just pick up the phone and call everybody and give them an update, right? Or they're not picking up conversations in the office, or you're not having the day-to-day interactions with nearly a number of people. And that's where really clear, consistent, aligned communication, having SOPs, having systems and structure to scale, those things become really important. And I think they're very challenging. I mean, when you look at a lot of companies and their evolution, going from 0 to 1, in terms of dollars or units or customers or just getting going, really difficult, but very, very different difficulties than going from your first dollar to your first million and then your 10 millionth dollar. And so, as you scale, alignment, focus, execution become, to me, one of the top ones, not necessarily, certainly not the only one, but one of the top ones.
I think you're on to something. I think I see a lot in the organizations that I work with too, as growth is happening, people are promoted into higher level roles, and leaders tend to think that because they're good at something they were doing, they're automatically going to be good at a leadership role. And I always try to explain that once you become especially in a higher level leadership role, right? You have 2 full-time jobs. You have your day job, and now you're a leader, and if you don't have the right skills, and just because you're good at something doesn't make your skills ready for that next level. So it sounds like you're really aware and paying attention. You mentioned perseverance, coachability, and accountability in your article. Mm-hmm. So let's unpack those and tell me what's behind those for you.
Well, on the perseverance side, I will sometimes or oftentimes refer to that as force of nature. And so, I've worked at a variety of different companies in a variety of different stages, everything from PE-backed companies to venture capital to family-owned, kind of family office companies to public companies. And so some were billion-dollar companies early in my career. Others were when I had an executive job or president CEO jobs where we went from 0 to 1 or 1 to 10 million or 10 to one specifically 30 to 100 million. So each stage is a little bit different. In a bigger company, you certainly need a number of facilitators, right? And even mid-sized company, facilitators keep the trains moving, teamwork, and perhaps even elite level of collegiality is perhaps more appreciated in a larger company, whereas in a smaller company, not that it's not appreciated, but what I tend to believe you need are both teammates that are good collaborators, but also great forces of nature. And so, this perseverance, a synonym for that I use frequently is force of nature, which is I want someone to come in, take something, run with it. I'd rather have them to kind of use the adage or the expression, beg for forgiveness than ask for permission. And it's tough to do that in a big company. And generally in a big company, that's not very well rewarded or appreciated. I mean, there's very few instances where people can absorb that in a mid to big size company because of the dynamics of a mid to big size company. Whereas in a small entrepreneurial company that's growing, that's trying to do something disruptive, that's fighting against the status quo, that's competing against big beverage companies that have, hundreds of millions of dollars that they're pouring into trying to get people more fixated onto sugary, carbonated, caffeinated drinks. We have to do things differently. We can't just work the same number of hours as them. We don't have the same budgets as them. We don't have the same marketing and sales and commercial resources. We have to do things that are a bit different. And part of that difference is having a product that people fall in love with that radically changes their behavior and the outcomes. Part of that is having the people that will be forces of nature. And so that's a big one. Coachability is, another synonym for that would be humility. And there's a balance, which is when you're running a company, if you're working in a company, and I think this goes with life too, which is it's healthy to have a good amount of confidence. Like if you don't have confidence, then, there are other problems that will present, and, there's amplification of stopgaps and weaknesses that will magnify if you lack the proper confidence. The problem with too much confidence is it leads to arrogance, and that's a problem as well. And so I really think this coachability piece is tied to humility. People that are coachable have generally a healthy dose of humility. People that are not coachable and get incredibly defensive and they get retaliatory or they get aggressive or they get confrontational with it, that's generally just not rooted in them not being coachable. That's really rooted in ego and arrogance, or could be a lack of confidence. They could be so underconfident or insecure, but it's generally one of those things where either they're really, really cocky or they're really, really unsure of themselves, both of which can be course corrected, but it's really hard to correct both if they're uncoachable, because part of that coaching is to try to like draw at, hey, how do we get you to a point where you're achieving greatness, or here's what the bar looks like, and here's how we can do this better. I think some of that gets solved through repetition. It's a little bit like a speaking engagement or running a training session or your first sales pitch or the first time that you swing a golf club or whatever it is. I'm not a golfer, but whatever it is, whether it's a sport or having tough conversations at work or at home or raising kids, repetition with refinement really is the magic to it. And the more that people get comfortable in sharing feedback as well as receiving feedback, it just gets a lot easier. Then it's like, oh, okay, great. Like, got that. Like, I'm going to like make note of that and try to adjust next time. The first few times it's uncomfortable. So, first 10 times might be a little hard to absorb. The 100th time you start to get a little bit more comfortable with it. And so I think repetition helps with that tremendously. And then the accountability is a simple one, which is doing what you say you're going to do and delivering and being dependable. And part of that is rooted, another synonym for that would be, can I trust this person? If they say they're going to do something, can I take to the bank that they're going to do it? They're going to be trustworthy. They're going to deliver on this. No one's perfect, of course, but I mean, they need to be doing that 90% of the time rather than like half the time. Because if it's half the time, then that doesn't help much, because I don't know which half is going to get done and when it's going to get done, if it's going to get done. You want to be able to have people in the team that you really can rely on. And that doesn't mean that they get it right every time. I don't get it right every time. Far from it. But having the accountability to say, hey, this rests with me. I've got to be a force of nature. I've got to work with teammates to get it done, but I've got to get it done and it's on me to get it done. Those are what I think are three important factors for a healthy team.
No, I love that. And I couldn't have said that better myself. That's exactly.
I bet you could have. I bet you could have said it shorter too, but thank you.
Yeah, that was wonderful. So I'm going to ask you a little bit of a different kind of question, but I think it's something that our listeners might want to know. I want you to think back to your childhood. And I want you to think if there's one memory or one experience that you had in your childhood that maybe created or helped create the leader that you are today and the company that you're running today.
The first thing that comes to mind is playing on team sports. Whether you do that as a youngster, like a real youngster, or like through high school or college, I would say playing on team sports was certainly really transformative for me because it's competitive. It requires teamwork, but it also requires individual accountability. You win and lose as a team, but those wins and losses as a team have a lot to do with how the team plays together and then how well you do individually and whether you're playing your position, whatever that sport is. Perseverance, that's another one. Coachability is another one because you're getting coached all the time. And, there's kind of this expression that, or this understanding that when you are being coached by a coach in a team sport, or it could be an individual sport as well, that you shouldn't worry when you're getting coached. It's when the coach gives up on coaching you, which is when there's a real problem, because then they're putting their eyes on someone else to refine and develop because they've kind of given up, so to speak, in terms of pushing. And I think there's a lot of lessons that I've learned just through reading books about great teams, watching some great sports movies about that, but then also playing on sports. So that stands out as a series of moments over a period of years as something that was, a catalyst for me.
I love that. Sounds like you learned some great lessons in doing that. So that's awesome. I want to ask you one more question before we kind of try to wrap it up. But it's about disruption a little bit. It's about AI. It's about things changing. I've been doing leadership coaching with senior executives, CEOs and C-suite executives now since 2011. That's all I've been doing. And within the last 6 months, I've noticed something I find really interesting. And that is that the skills required to lead right now today are different than they've ever been before. They're not completely different. You still need all the same skills you've had. But right now, we have to be able to get people to move faster, think more expansively, think more strategically, because things are happening at rapid pace. And AI, for example, is disrupting every single industry out there. And we can have our team and we can have them on board and we're moving toward a direction. All of a sudden, the technology changes. And on a dime, we have to be able to change that team and refocus where they're headed. I'm curious your thoughts on that and what you've been doing with your teams to keep them really agile and with expansive thinking and moving forward.
Well, I agree with your assessment, especially over the last couple of years. And this is why, one of the things that's really important to me as we hire, and you can't do this for every single position. You don't need to do this for every single position. But when you're looking at leadership level faculties, bringing people on that have very strong critical thinking skills is hyper important. And the reason it's hyper important, in case it's not super obvious, is that people with good critical thinking skills can pivot and navigate and go to the next thing and figure out the next thing. And so if someone has gotten to where they are, and this is not uncommon in many companies, and these are behaviors that can also be improved and changed if someone has been in this track of they've kind of been there, done that, followed the roadmap, and they haven't really developed their critical thinking skills because they've been able to use the same roadmap or the same playbook for 20, 30 years. It's going to be really hard for them to think about or even comprehend how they might integrate AI into their business or how their competitors are going to be using AI to disrupt themselves. And so I think critical thinking skills and just hiring, I'll draw a parallel in a second around what I look for in bringing people on board, but making sure that they have those critical thinking skills coupled with things like coachability so that we can be willing to reset ourselves, but also the company and look at, okay, this is what got us to here over the last 5 years. It might be the very thing that's going to keep us from getting to there over the next 5 years. So you do have to be willing to break things or stop doing things that used to feel like sacred cows. And certainly this is something that big companies talk about. It's very hard for big companies to do that though, because they're like a battleship and they turn very slowly, and it's easier to say things and have perspectives and philosophies than to actually implement many of those just because of the nature of the structure and kind of organizational culture. And so critical thinking obviously is a really key one. And I like really smart people working in the organization, but at the same time, being smart is not enough. It needs to be coupled with many of these other skill sets of teamwork and chemistry compatibility and aligned mission and values, trust. Other things that I do with my team to kind of get to the root of the question that you asked, part of what I hope to achieve, and I feel like at various times I do anywhere from like not such a good job of this to a good job of this is, and I'm really constantly trying to do a good job of this, a great job of this, is to just have unbridled, open conversation. So what I don't personally like having a thought and then having to tiptoe around how to say it. Now, it doesn't mean you get to say it however you want to say it, because we all have to be responsible for how we kind of deliver that information. But the idea of saying, hey, I think this is a really bad idea. Here's why I think this is a bad idea. Or I think we should scrap this and do something else. There are so many thoughts that people have around that go unspoken because they're afraid of offending their boss, or they might feel like it's politically incorrect, or they're going against the grain and they're the outlier. And I think having just brutally honest conversations and encouraging disagreement and debate is a tough thing to do for people, but it's, to me, the most fun part of business, because if you operate under a scenario called, well, my idea always wins, then it's tough for people to be brutally honest. If you operate under the best idea wins, then people are more open to being honest and forthright with their thoughts and their ideas. And so I kind of have a statement that I often make to the team is, and I've said this also, we all have bosses. So I've also said this to my boss, which is, hey, at the end of the day, I'm going to do what you want me to do. If you tell me to do it, I'm going to fully support it and back it. But until that day comes, if you want me to do my best on behalf of FloWater as well as a global company, I'm going to give you my unvarnished feedback all along the way until you say, hey, I want to call it and this is what we're doing, then full speed ahead. And that's the same request that I have of my team, which is, hey, if I have to call it, and sometimes I do, and we don't have full consensus, I need your full backing. Until then, tell me why you think I'm wrong, or tell the team why you think we're wrong on this and what we should be doing differently. And then I kind of end that with, ultimately, I feel like everyone deserves an explanation as to why I or we did what we did. They don't have to agree with it, but I do expect them to support it. And to support it, I expect them to be able to understand why we did what we did and how we made the decision after taking all of the inputs. And I think all of those things, start to help, but it goes back to repetition as well, which is you have to get the reps in. And as people start to new hires, they might be a little uncomfortable debating me, but then after a few months, they're like, oh, okay, great. Like I can go toe to toe and tell this guy exactly what I think and tell him why I think this is a bad idea. And, it's hard to create a safety around that, but I think it's an important effort to expend towards creating a culture of transparency, trust, and truth-telling.
100% agree. One of the exercises we do with executive teams is anybody that has a new idea, like we kind of teach them that the idea is great and you're all behind it and you believe in it and you're passionate about it. And the next thing we ask you to do is go in front of whomever it is that your coworkers or downline, whoever it is, and say, all right, this is my idea. This is how I want to move forward. I want to spend the next 45 minutes with all of you telling me why it sucks. Because you want them to poke holes in it, and you want to encourage that, and that's exactly, it sounds like what you're doing, and I love that.
Well, we're and always working on it, right? I want to have also myself enough humility to know probably not everybody feels that way all the time, but I think those people that have worked with us for a while, after a while, the culture, this is the great thing about culture, and it's the downside to culture, which is if you have a culture where people are comfortable doing this throughout the organization, then it self-perpetuates in a positive way, upward direction. The reverse is true, which is if every new idea or pushback gets, clamped down on and stomped down, and there's a repercussion or a price to pay for that, well, it has the same reciprocating force, just in a downward direction. And so if we can move up to the right consistently, proceed with enough confidence and humility, then I think we're hopefully directionally going in the right way, but it's something that we just constantly need to work on.
I think I could sit here and talk leadership with you for a very long time, but our listeners, I'm going to kind of wrap this up a little bit. I want to ask you, for listeners who want to learn more about your work, how can they connect with you or your business? And I kind of want to piggyback on that. Do you only provide FloWater machines for hotels and businesses, or is this something people can get in their home?
So I'll answer the questions in reverse order. FloWater refill stations are deployed in many, many thousands of locations throughout the entire United States, primarily hotels, schools, gyms, corporations, retailers. We've got also big company names that you would know very, very well, distribution centers, warehouses, as well as fire departments, for example. There's 35, 40 fire departments in Southern California that all have FloWater units that are using to hydrate the first responders. So it's almost all B2B right now. We do, through our sister company, have and kind of new parent company, Bluewater, under sink systems that are used both commercially and in consumer applications. So those are available, and you can find, and I'll go to your first question now. You can find all of that on www.drinkflowwater.com. Not only information about the refill station and use cases and outcomes data as a result of people using our products, but then also the Bluewater under sink units that are called Spirit, Cleone, and Pro that can be used again residentially as well as commercially for food and beverage, coffee outlets, hotels, etc. And then to find us on social handles at Drink FloWater. And then personally, I'm at Rich Razgaitis. So that's how you can get in touch with us. And Cynthia, thanks for the opportunity to be on your podcast. I appreciate it.
Al, thank you for being here. And we will post all of those links in the show notes. And for our listeners, thank you for tuning in to the Care to Lead video series today. If you found this episode valuable and you want to stay updated on our latest interviews and insights, remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel or find us on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, remember, leaders who care to lead. Thank you.